It was a perfect spring afternoon in Central Park, the kind that brought families out to play and kids to study under the warm sunshine. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their pink petals occasionally drifting down in the gentle breeze. Officer Miller had been with the department for 8 years, and these park patrol shifts were usually his quietest assignments. As he walked along the winding path, his polished boots crunching on the gravel, he noticed a young girl sitting alone on a wooden bench near the fountain. She couldn't have been more than 12, wearing a neat school uniform with a backpack beside her. Her head was buried in what looked like a thick science textbook, and several notebooks were spread out on the bench. Instead of seeing an innocent student doing her homework, Miller's mind immediately jumped to conclusions. In recent weeks, there had been reports of young people causing trouble in the park, though none of those incidents had happened anywhere near this peaceful spot. Something about the situation bothered him, despite the obvious signs that she was just a student studying. "Hey, you can't loiter here," he called out, his voice unnecessarily harsh as he approached the bench. The girl looked up from her book, startled by his tone. Her eyes widened with confusion and a hint of fear, but she maintained her composure. "I'm sorry, officer," she replied politely, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I'm just waiting for my mom. She works at the station nearby, and this is where I always study after school until she—" Miller cut her off mid-sentence. "Sure, that's what they all say. This bench isn't for hanging around all day. Pack up your things." A few passers-by slowed their walks, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. An elderly couple on their daily stroll exchanged worried glances. The girl began carefully gathering her study materials, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to keep her papers from flying away in the spring breeze. "Sir, I can show you my student ID," she offered, reaching for her backpack. "And I can call my mom right now. She's actually—" "Hands where I can see them," Miller barked, his hand moving to rest on his belt. The girl froze, her eyes now filling with tears she was trying hard not to shed. A young mother pushing a stroller nearby pulled out her phone and began recording, recognizing that something wasn't right about this situation. The cherry blossoms continued to fall gently around them, a stark contrast to the tension building in this small corner of the park. Other kids who had been playing nearby stopped their games to watch, their laughter fading into confused silence. The girl sat perfectly still, her science textbook still open to a page about the solar system, a half-finished homework assignment visible on top of her notebook. She was doing everything right, staying calm, speaking respectfully, offering to prove her identity, just as her parents had taught her. But Miller seemed determined to see something that wasn't there. A small crowd had begun to gather at a respectful distance, their presence both a witness to the unfolding injustice and a silent protest against it. The girl's eyes darted hopefully to each new face, maybe expecting to see someone who knew her, someone who could verify her story. But Miller had already made up his mind, his judgment clouded by prejudices he wouldn't even admit to himself. The afternoon sun continued to shine cheerfully overhead, oblivious to the dark moment unfolding beneath it. In just 10 minutes, this peaceful study session would turn into something that would change not only this young girl's life, but the entire police department. And Officer Miller had no idea that his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would bring his career crashing down around him. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the peaceful park, drawing even more attention to the troubling scene. The young girl's textbook slipped from her lap, landing face down on the path, its pages crumpling beneath it. Her carefully organized notes scattered in the breeze. Homework assignments she'd spent hours on now floating away like the cherry blossoms above. "Please, officer," she pleaded, her voice trembling but still remarkably composed for someone so young. "My phone's right there in my backpack. Just let me call my mom. She's expecting me to be here. She works right over at the—" "You can make your call at the station," Miller interrupted, his tone dismissive. He seemed oblivious to the growing number of phones recording his every move, or perhaps he simply didn't care. The crowd had grown larger now, their murmurs of disapproval becoming more audible. A kind-looking woman in a business suit stepped forward, her own daughter clutching her hand. "Officer, I walk through this park every day. This young lady is always here studying. She's not causing any trouble." "Ma'am, please step back," Miller ordered, positioning himself between the woman and the girl. This is police business. The girl's school uniform jacket had gotten twisted uncomfortably as her hands were cuffed behind her back, but she didn't struggle or resist. Instead, she kept her head high, even as tears silently rolled down her cheeks. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Stay calm, stay dignified, and remember who you are. More park visitors had stopped to witness the scene, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. A jogger had paused his run, pulling out his phone to join the others in documenting the incident. An ice cream vendor who knew the girl as a regular customer shook his head in disbelief, his cheerful bell silent for the first time that afternoon. My homework, the girl said softly, watching her papers continue to drift away. Please, can someone collect my homework? I spent all week on that science project. Her simple, heartbreaking request seemed to break something in the crowd. 2 college students immediately began gathering her scattered papers, carefully smoothing each crumpled page. An elderly man picked up her textbook, brushing off the dirt with his handkerchief. These small acts of kindness stood in stark contrast to the officer's cold behavior. You're making a big mistake, a man in a business suit called out, his phone steady as he recorded. This is going to be all over social media in an hour. Miller scoffed, but something flickered across his face, the first hint of uncertainty. Still, he pressed on, pride or prejudice preventing him from backing down. He began reading the girl her rights, his voice mechanically reciting words that should never have been spoken to a child simply doing her homework. The girl's legs shook slightly as she was led toward the park exit, but she walked with remarkable dignity. Her backpack and schoolwork were carefully gathered by the kind strangers who promised to bring everything to the police station. The crowd followed at a respectful distance, many still recording, others on their phones apparently calling news stations or the police department itself. As they reached the police car, the girl finally spoke again, her voice clear and steady despite her tears. My mom always says that truth comes out in the end. She says justice might take time, but it always comes. And she would know. She sees it happen every day at work. Miller didn't respond as he helped her into the back seat, but several observers exchanged knowing looks. There was something about the way she spoke about her mother, something in her quiet confidence despite the situation, that suggested Officer Miller might have just made the biggest mistake of his career. The police car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a park full of angry witnesses and a growing social media storm. What should have been another quiet spring afternoon had turned into something that would soon shake the entire police department to its core. And in just a few minutes, Officer Miller would learn exactly why this particular arrest would cost him everything he'd worked for. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the police station as Officer Miller strode through the doors, looking pleased with himself. The young girl walked beside him, her head held high despite her tear-stained cheeks. Her school uniform, usually so neat, was wrinkled from the ordeal in the park. Got a loiterer from Central Park, Miller announced loudly to the booking sergeant, who was finishing up some paperwork at the front desk. No ID, refusing to give a proper explanation for why she was hanging around. The booking sergeant, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, looked up from his papers. His expression shifted from routine interest to confusion as he saw the handcuffed girl. She couldn't have been more than 12, and she was wearing a prestigious private school uniform that he immediately recognized. Actually, sir, the girl spoke up quietly, her voice steady despite everything. I tried to show him my student ID and call my mom, but he wouldn't let me. The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. Recognition dawned in his expression, followed quickly by alarm. Officer Miller, he said slowly, did you ask this young lady her name? Didn't need to, Miller replied dismissively. Caught her loitering clear as day. You should have seen how she was spread out all over that park bench, taking up space with books and papers everywhere. The girl spoke again, her voice gaining strength. I was doing my science homework, sir. I always study there while waiting for my mom to finish her shift. I'm not allowed to be home alone after school. The sergeant stood up suddenly, his chair rolling backward. Officer Miller removed those handcuffs immediately. His voice had taken on an urgent tone that made several nearby officers stop what they were doing and turn to watch. But sir, the paperwork, Miller started to protest. Remove them now, the sergeant ordered, already reaching for his phone. His hands were shaking slightly as he dialed, and the color had drained from his face. Miller reluctantly began removing the handcuffs, looking confused by his superior's reaction. The young girl rubbed her wrists gently as they were freed, still maintaining remarkable composure for someone her age. Just then, the front doors burst open again. 2 college students hurried in, carrying the girl's backpack and carefully gathered schoolwork from the park. They'd kept their promise to bring her belongings, and more supporters from the park were visible outside, some still recording on their phones. The booking sergeant was speaking quietly but urgently into his phone. "Chief, you need to come down here right now." "Yes, right now. It's about your daughter." The word daughter seemed to echo through the suddenly silent station. Miller's face went from confusion to shock, then to horror as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Other officers who had gathered to watch the scene unfold took involuntary steps backward, distancing themselves from what they knew was about to become a career-ending mistake. "Your daughter?" Miller stammered, looking at the girl with new eyes. Now he could see it, the familiar determined set of her jaw, the same confident posture he'd seen in his boss every day. The girl who had been so calm, so certain that justice would prevail, was the daughter of none other than the police chief herself. The girl sat down in a chair by the surgeon's desk, pulling her recovered science textbook close to her chest. "I tried to tell you about my mom," she said quietly, not with anger but with a sadness that seemed to cut through the entire room. "I was right where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing." The station had never felt so quiet. The usual bustle of police work had completely stopped as everyone waited for the inevitable arrival of the chief. Officers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at Miller's colossal error in judgment. The booking sergeant was already pulling up internal affairs paperwork on his computer, his expression grim. Through the windows, they could see more people gathering outside the station. News vans were beginning to arrive, their satellite dishes extending skyward. The videos from the park had already gone viral, and now that the identity of the girl was becoming known, this was about to become much bigger than a simple wrongful arrest. In the heavy silence, the sound of rapid footsteps approaching from the back of the station made everyone turn. Miller stood frozen, watching the hallway that led to the chief's office, knowing that his entire career was about to unravel in front of his eyes. The next few moments would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire department. The click of heels against the polished floor echoed through the silent police station. Every officer present stood a little straighter, their eyes fixed on the hallway. The police chief emerged, her uniform pristine, her stride purposeful. To those who knew her well, the supple tightness around her mouth and the slight flaring of her nostrils were the only signs of the fury she was containing. She'd been in the middle of a budget meeting when the call came. 20 years on the force, and she'd never left a meeting so quickly. Now, seeing her daughter sitting by the booking sergeant's desk, still clutching her science textbook like a shield, the chief felt her heart break and strengthen all at once. The young girl looked up as her mother approached, and for a brief moment had carefully maintained composure cracked. Her lower lip trembled, and fresh tears welled in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, her voice small but carrying in the dead silent room. The chief didn't rush. She didn't run. She walked with measured steps to her daughter, every eye in the station following her movement. As she passed Officer Miller, he seemed to shrink into himself, but she didn't spare him a glance. Her focus was entirely on her child. Kneeling beside her daughter's chair, the chief gently took the textbook from her trembling hands and set it on the desk. Then she did something that made several officers blink back tears of their own. She carefully straightened her daughter's crooked uniform collar and smoothed down her rumpled jacket, just as she did every morning before school. "Are you hurt?" the chief asked softly, examining her daughter's wrists where the handcuffs had been. "No, Mom. I did everything like you taught me." I stayed calm. I didn't resist. The girl's voice grew stronger with each word. "I knew you'd come." The chief pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, and for a moment they weren't chief and officer's child. They were simply mother and daughter. The gathered officers watched as their normally stoic leader held her little girl, whispering words of comfort that only they could hear. When the chief finally stood, her daughter's hand firmly in hers, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Now, at last, she turned to face Officer Miller, who had been standing rooted to the spot, watching his career crumble before his eyes. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice perfectly level but carrying an edge that made everyone present stand straighter. "My daughter has attended the same school for 6 years. She has studied in that same spot in the park every school day for the past 2 years, waiting for my shift to end. Every officer on Park 2B knows this. Every one of them." Miller opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The chief continued, her voice growing colder with each word. "She was wearing her school uniform. She had her student ID. She was surrounded by textbooks and homework. She tried to contact me. And yet you chose to see something else entirely, didn't you, Officer Miller?" The silence in the station was deafening. Through the windows, they could see the crowd outside growing larger. News reporters were setting up their cameras, and social media was already exploding with videos of the park incident. "Mom," the girl spoke up suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "All my homework got scattered in the park. But those nice college students brought it back." She gestured to her rescued schoolwork, now neatly stacked on the surgeon's desk. "I have a science project due tomorrow." Something in the chief's expression softened for a moment as she looked at her daughter. Even after everything that had happened, her child was still worried about her schoolwork. Then her eyes hardened again as she turned back to Miller. "Hand over your badge and gun," she ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Report to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning at 9. For now, you're suspended pending investigation." Officer Miller's hands shook as he removed his badge and weapon, placing them on the booking surgeon's desk. The metallic sound they made seemed to echo through the station like a final gavel strike. As mother and daughter gathered the schoolwork and prepared to leave, the chief paused for one final moment. "My daughter's science project is about action and reaction," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent station. "I believe, Officer Miller, you're about to learn a great deal about both." The automatic doors swished open as they left, the sound of reporters' questions and camera shutters mixing with the spring breeze. Behind them, they left a station full of officers who had just witnessed what happens when prejudice meets justice, and a former officer who was beginning to realize that his worst 10 minutes of judgment would become his most powerful lesson in karma. The next morning arrived with a storm of media attention outside the police station. The sun had barely risen, but newsbands lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the pink morning sky. Inside, the atmosphere was just as charged, though much quieter. The chief sat at her desk, reviewing the flood of emails that had poured in overnight. Videos of her daughter's arrest had spread like wildfire across social media. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, calls from the mayor's office, civil rights organizations, and concerned community members. A gentle knock on her office door made her look up. The booking surgeon from yesterday entered, carrying a thick folder. "Chief," he said softly, "I've gathered all the witness statements from the park. Over 30 people came in last night to file reports. And those college students who brought your daughter's homework? They uploaded their videos, and they've already got millions of views." The chief nodded, taking the folder. "How's the mood out there?" she asked, gesturing toward the main office area. "Every officer is behind you, Chief," he replied firmly. "What happened yesterday? It opened a lot of eyes. Some of the younger officers are asking about additional training. They want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Through her office window, the chief could see her daughter's empty study spot in the park across the street. A small group of people had gathered there, placing flowers and handwritten notes on the bench. Someone had taped a sign that read, "Knowledge is power," to the back of the bench. Her computer pinged with another email, this one from the school board. They'd wanted to invite her daughter to speak to other students about knowing their rights and maintaining dignity under pressure. The chief felt a mix of pride and sadness. Her 12-year-old shouldn't have had to become an example of such a lesson. The sound of commotion from the main office drew their attention. Officer Miller had arrived for his meeting with Internal Affairs, trying to slip in through a side entrance to avoid the media. But news travels fast in a police station, and officers who had worked alongside him for years now turned their backs as he passed. "I've never seen anything like it," the surgeon commented, watching through the office window. "The whole department's united on this one. Even officers who usually stay quiet about these things are speaking up." The chief's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. Their daughter had made it to school safely. Despite everything, she'd insisted on going to class to present her science project. Action and reaction, the chief murmured, remembering their conversation from yesterday. A young officer appeared in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. "Chief, that is, some of us officers, we've started a petition. We want mandatory cultural sensitivity training, not just the basic course. Real, in-depth training. And we want to start a community outreach program, especially with local schools." The chief looked up, surprised but pleased. Change often came from unexpected places, and here were her officers, taking the initiative to be part of the solution. The booking sergeant smiled. "See? Good things can come from bad situations. Your daughter's strength yesterday, the way she handled herself, it made a lot of people think, made them want to do better." Another knock at the door revealed the mayor's assistant, looking harried. "Chief, the mayor would like to meet with you as soon as possible. And there's a group of community leaders in the lobby asking to speak with you. They're saying this could be a turning point for police-community relations." The chief stood up, straightening her uniform. Through her window, she could see even more people gathering at her daughter's study bench in the park. Students from her daughter's school had started arriving, each carrying a book and sitting down to study in peaceful protest. "Sometimes," she said, watching the growing crowd, "it takes one moment of injustice to spark 1,000 moments of change." She picked up Officer Miller's badge from her desk, its surface reflecting the morning light. In just a few hours, she would sit across from him in a review board meeting, but this wasn't just about one officer anymore. This had become about something much bigger, about change, about justice, and about making sure no other child would have to show the kind of courage her daughter had displayed. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across her office floor. Outside, the media crews were setting up for their morning broadcasts, ready to share the story with the world. But the real story wasn't in their cameras or microphones. It was in the quiet determination of a 12-year-old girl who went to school to present her science project, in the officers asking for better training, and in the community coming together to say, enough. Over the next few days, the Internal Affairs investigation uncovered more than anyone had expected. In a small conference room filled with manila folders and cups of cold coffee, investigators pieced together a troubling pattern in Officer Miller's past. "Look at this," one investigator said, spreading out complaint forms across the table. 6 different reports of aggressive behavior toward young minorities in the past year alone. All filed, all dismissed without proper investigation. The paper trail painted a picture that should have been spotted long ago. The videos from the park incident had become impossible to ignore. News channels played them on repeat, each showing a different angle of the same disturbing scene. The college students' footage was particularly damaging. Crystal clear shots of a young girl in a school uniform, completely calm, trying to explain herself to an officer who refused to listen. But it wasn't just the videos that were causing waves. The young girl's school records landed on the investigation team's desk, revealing an exceptional student who volunteered at the local library's reading program. Her science project, the one she'd been working on when arrested, had won first place despite everything that happened. "Here's something interesting," another investigator noted, pulling up personnel files on his computer. Miller's previous supervisor had flagged him for retraining twice, but the recommendations were never followed up. The paperwork just disappeared. The investigation team worked late into the night, their desk lamps casting long shadows on the walls. They interviewed park vendors who knew the girl as a regular presence, always polite, always studying. The ice cream seller remembered how she would help younger kids count their change. The pretzel vendor recalled how she once gave her umbrella to an elderly couple when it started raining. Outside the station, the story had taken on a life of its own. Students from across the city had started a study-in movement, bringing their homework to parks in a peaceful show of solidarity. Parents shared stories of having to teach their children about prejudice far too early. The incident had touched a nerve, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions and bias. The investigation team called in officers who had previously worked the park beat. "She was there every school day," one veteran officer testified. "Always in her uniform, always studying. Most of us would check on her, make sure she was okay. Some even helped her with math homework occasionally. Social media had exploded with support. The hashtag #StudyingIsNotACrime trended for days. Videos surfaced of other students sharing their experiences of being treated with suspicion for simply existing in public spaces. What had started as one incident was revealing a deeper systemic issue. Miller's work computer revealed concerning internet search history, he had repeatedly viewed websites promoting racial bias and discriminatory viewpoints. His body camera footage from previous encounters showed a clear pattern of treating minorities differently than other citizens. The investigation team interviewed the chief's daughter too, in a gentle, age-appropriate way. She sat in the interview room, poised and articulate, describing the incident with remarkable clarity. "I just want to know why my homework made me look suspicious," she said, a question that left the hardened investigators struggling for answers. Community leaders began organizing town halls to discuss police-community relations. Local teachers spoke about students afraid to study in public. Civil rights activists pointed out how this incident, caught on camera and happening to a police chief's daughter, was finally making people pay attention to an everyday reality for many families. The investigation's scope widened beyond Miller. How had previous complaints been overlooked? Why hadn't supervisors acted on warning signs? The team discovered that the department's complaint tracking system was outdated, allowing legitimate concerns to fall through the cracks. During their third late night of reviewing evidence, one investigator sat back, rubbing his tired eyes. "You know what's remarkable?" he said to his colleagues. "That young girl knew exactly what to do. She stayed calm, tried to explain, asked to call her mother. She did everything right. And she still ended up in handcuffs." The weight of those words hung heavy in the room. They all knew that for every incident caught on camera, countless others went unrecorded. For every victim who had a police chief for a parent, many others had no one powerful in their corner. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the team prepared their final report. The evidence was overwhelming, not just against Miller, but against a system that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked for so long. Their recommendations would go far beyond one officer's dismissal. Real change was needed, and for once, it seemed like everyone was ready to listen. 3 weeks after the park incident, the police station's largest conference room was packed for a special announcement. Journalists filled the back rows, cameras ready. Community leaders sat in the front, alongside school administrators and civil rights advocates. The tension in the air was palpable. The police chief stood at the podium, her daughter sitting proudly in the front row. The girl wore her school uniform as always, but now she carried herself differently, not as a victim, but as someone who had helped create change. "Today," the chief began, her voice clear and strong, "we're announcing several major changes in our department. First, Officer Miller has been permanently dismissed from the force. But this is about more than one officer. This is about transforming how we serve and protect our community." The room fell silent as she outlined the new initiatives. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training would now be required every 6 months, not just during initial hiring. A new community oversight board would review all complaints, ensuring transparency. Body camera footage would be regularly audited for signs of bias. But the biggest announcement came last. "We're launching a new youth outreach program," the chief announced, designed and led by young people themselves. "And I'm proud to say that my daughter will be one of its first youth advisors." The girl stood up, walking to join her mother at the podium. Over the past weeks, she had turned her traumatic experience into something powerful. She had spoken at school assemblies, sharing her story and encouraging other young people to know their rights while maintaining their dignity. "I don't want anyone else to feel afraid while just trying to study," she said into the microphone, her voice steady. "Parks and public spaces should be safe for everyone. Your appearance, your age, or the color of your skin shouldn't make you suspicious." The room burst into applause. In the back, the college students who had helped gather her homework that day wiped away tears. Their videos had helped spark this change, and now they were part of the youth outreach program too. Former Officer Miller's desk had been cleared out days ago, but in its place, something new had grown. Officers had set up a small library of law books and civil rights materials, available for anyone in the community to borrow. They called it the Knowledge Corner, a reminder that learning should never be seen as suspicious. The chief's daughter had turned her science project about action and reaction into something bigger. She now taught other kids about positive reactions to negative situations. Her story had become a case study in local schools, teaching students about civil rights, peaceful resistance, and the power of staying calm under pressure. Local businesses around the park had put up new signs. "Students welcome here" and "safe study space." The bench where she had been arrested was now officially designated as a student study spot, with a small plaque telling her story. Other parks across the city were creating similar areas, complete with free Wi-Fi for students. "But we're not done," the chief continued, laying out plans for the future. "Every officer will now spend time volunteering in our local schools. We're creating a scholarship program for minority students interested in law enforcement. Real change means creating bridges between the police and the community we serve." The girls' regular study spot in the park was never empty now. Other students had made it their own, often helping each other with homework. Officers on patrol would stop by, not to question but to offer help with math problems or quiz kids on their history facts. As the press conference ended, reporters rushed to get final comments. But the most powerful moment came when a young boy approached the chief's daughter. "I was scared to study in the park," he admitted. "But now I see you doing it every day. You made it safe for all of us." She smiled, pulling out her science textbook. "Want to study together?" she asked. Soon, they were joined by other students, spreading their books across several benches. Officers on patrol nodded approvingly as they passed by. The sun set on another day in the park, casting long shadows across the study benches. Where once there had been fear and prejudice, now there was learning and hope. The chief watched from her office window as her daughter helped a younger student with homework, knowing that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. In the end, karma hadn't just hit one officer, it had transformed an entire department, a community, and most importantly, it had shown that even the youngest among us could stand up for what's right and create lasting change.